also do this. Okay, so that's how it is.
Work.
Yes.
My name is Paul Reynolds. I'm with the Georgia Mason School of Public Policy. You presented us 15 slides. I'm very curious about what would be on slide 16, which would have been your discussion about how to help some of these natural societies convert to an open system. Apparently, we only can hear about that if we're at the World Bank.
I think one of the very interesting things about this project was that one of the key questions in economic history is explaining the emergence of modern societies. So in some sense, economic history is about explaining the successful places. Economic development is explaining those that didn't succeed. So when we approached this problem, we came at the problem of explaining the transition. And that's when we went to the World Bank to do that. And they said, well, this really doesn't help because what you're saying is most of these societies aren't ready to do that yet. Answering Mary Shirley's question, I've actually written a paper, Mary Shirley's right here for those of you who've read it, about why does it take 400 years of cultural development for a country to actually become modern? And so the second development problem became really apparent to us, which is how do natural states develop sophisticated organizations and the ability to sustain impersonal relationships between the elites that can enable it to make this transition. Now, do we have lots of nice answers in slide 16? The answer is no, because in fact, this is conceptualizing the answer to your question. That is the first development problem, which is how do you get to the point where you can sustain impersonality and therefore make open access work, is a much more difficult and not so well asked question. So that's one of the big implications that we're going forward with. And we're trying to get people at the bank who know about developing countries and not so much about the economic history of the Western world to begin to inform that discussion.
Work aside.
The question I have is, I'm Kevin McKay from the economics department here. The question I have is, so you have coalitions of elite who are successful at somehow mitigating violence, agreeing not to be violent, and yet at the same time they can't create economic success. So they fail to take full advantage of the property rights they've created for themselves. And I wonder, is it because economic growth would ruin the equilibrium they set themselves for the decisions to not be violent? Or is it because they can't rent seek against the people they own, so to speak? Or is it a combination of it? What do you think about that? Because it seems funny that they're smart enough to solve this really hard problem, and they can't solve the economic problem.
Well, remember several points. First of all, the way to think about natural states looks very different if we think about them today versus if we think about them over the last 10,000 years. Over the last 10,000 years before the appearance of open access orders, natural states were very successful in comparison to the alternatives. So there's lots of economic growth, such as the ancient world from roughly 700 BC to year zero, for example. And so in that sense, the natural states can produce economic growth. It's only in comparison to open access orders that they have that their problems emerge. Second, remember, there's more than one margin here as part of what we're saying. There is the margin about economic growth and returns from generating greater economic growth, but there's also the problem of violence. And there's a trade-off between the two of them in this framework. And that's the fundamental logic of why it is that natural states cannot easily move into economic development through open access, because the more they do that, then the less strong are the mechanisms that prevent violence. So it takes a special set of circumstances, which, as we said, moving into the doorstep conditions that actually allow a natural state to solve those problems.
Binayak Sen from the World Bank. I have just two questions to ask, very short. Marx in Capital said that for the slavery in the old world, the slavery in the new world was needed, something to that effect, meaning there may be a connection, global, between the open access state formation and the functioning of the natural state. And that is also partly hinted in your initial exposition when you say that sometimes the developed societies create conditions which also act as an hindrance to the spontaneous alternatives of development on the part of the natural states. Second question is, am I right from your last comment to interpret that there is no one linear model of transition from lower states to upper states? And if you remember the debate in Russia between the sort of Narodniks and the sort of others in the early 20th century, that even the backward countries or medium level income countries can also sort of, bypass certain stages into higher order, and also the recent experience of China. So basically, as you hinted probably in your last comment, am I right in understanding that natural states not necessarily have to follow the classical model of development of the open access society? There may be certain conditions by which actually they need to, like during your transition model, they need to pass through certain stages before the roots of the open access society can sort of flourish.
I'll take the last part of that.
That's what I just said.
You can't have that. There's certainly no typical pattern of change. And that's because every society has its own culture, its own heritage, its own way it evolved, and no two are alike. And so that's just one of the reasons why if I go and advise third world countries, I spend at least 6 months trying to learn enough about their background, history, beliefs, and so on, so that I can be more or less sensible about where they are and therefore what the margin is at which we can move them. Now what we did try to describe in the book is 3 different levels of the natural state: fragile, stable, and mature. And they were different levels in which the degree of institutional, organizational structure evolves to become more complex, more specialization and division of labor, and therefore not progress, but a framework that is more amenable to keeping on evolving. So one of the key things which we want to advise countries, if they're World Bank or whatever, is that they should recognize where a particular political economic entity is, and then incrementally attempt to move it along towards becoming a mature natural state, which then would put them on the door, available for the doorstep conditions, which would move them into open access. But you cannot to take a straightforward example in the paper today, you cannot take Iraq and expect that you're going to impose democracy on it and get anything worth a damn. You're not, because democracy in the way in which the kind of political institutions that really make it viable is a very complex structure and very intimately connected with economic organization. So you've got to move along to where you can create a structure that can handle all those problems, and that means you've got to understand where you are in the natural state and what kind of incremental changes you can make which will move you along towards a more mature one.
I want to say something about the second part of the question there, the second question as well, about there not being one linear path, and I think that's exactly right. In the book we spend a lot of time on the historic path of what we call the first movers, Great Britain, France, and the United States. And that's a very different path from later transitions. So we can think about more recent transitions such as Spain, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, for example, where within a generation or across a generation there's simultaneous opening access in both economics and politics. And if you look at the other cases in East Asia, such as South Korea or Taiwan, Those are cases now on the doorstep, but those are cases where economic access opened well before political access. And so those are all three different categories, and I'm sure there are significantly many more.
Thanks. Christian Nagenzuki, also the World Bank. I'm still trying to figure out what it is that we should be doing. I just wanted to ask, let's be honest, I just wanted to ask how you explain persistent conflict. I mean, you know, these countries that sort of decade after decade, it just sort of continues, and in some sense it seems like they don't even make it to the natural state. Somalia.
I don't know that we have any special insights into the problem of sustained violence like that, but one of the, Doug just mentioned the categories of the different kinds of natural states that we have, and one the simplest is the fragile natural state, and I think you're right, that countries that are have experienced various forms of disorder again and again and again have trouble even becoming a fragile natural state. Fragile natural state is one in which almost the only organizations are those that are part of the state themselves. The only organization is the state.
My name is Li Hao. I'm a PhD candidate in the economics department at George Mason. My question is for Dr. North. You just mentioned that it is important to have a political reform to back up the economic reform. So how far do you think China can go without a dramatic political reform, given it has been very successful in the last 30 years? And also, Chinese culture and the Taiwanese culture are very close. And we can see how messy the Taiwanese political process is now in terms of their election.
I'm going to take the first, I don't know, and you'll take the second. I've been off and on advisor to China for the last 15, 20 years, and so I go back there 2 or 3 times a year, or at least twice a year anyway. And certainly anybody who's done that is awed by the dramatic changes that have occurred in China. But the changes have been mostly changes at the economic level. That is, they've made markets more efficient and so on. But the central government has maintained a tight hold over the policy and the degree of freedom that it will permit. Now, in part, they've managed to continue development by the fact that they've shifted some of the decision-making from the central government to lower levels of government, and that has allowed for more flexibility. But they still have a fundamental dilemma, and the fundamental dilemma somewhere down the road is going to pose them a big, big problem, which is how they're going to release the stranglehold that they have and create what we believe in our framework is a necessary condition for an open access society, which is effective political competition at all levels.
I wanted to just emphasize a couple of those points because briefly, political reform is almost always identified with democracy. And if you think about democracy at the national level in China, then there's been zero progress in political reform. But that's not the only level of political reform that exists. And as Doug suggested, one of the really important features of Chinese reform has been political reform in the form of decentralization of power. So it's authoritarians giving up power, not through controls through elections, but giving up power through decentralization. And so there has been some form of political reform. There have been different eras, and it worked differently now than it did in the initial process of reform.
Fernando Alessandri. I have my own practice in conflict resolution and mediation. I'm trying to form an intelligent question. I don't have it yet. But when you talk about these natural states, I'm just constantly thinking of prisons, prison society, how you have these very organized gangs. it's very organized. It's not chaotic at all. Nobody dies without, nobody gets murdered without a shot call. They're called shot callers, saying someone from that gang has to die, and they have to approve the hit or order the hit. It's very organized, and it's a microcosm of what's going on in these other countries. And I'm wondering to what extent people have tried to study that, because you mentioned what's the World Bank doing in other countries. Like, we can't even get our own thing right here. Our prisons are the fastest growing populations, right? So, until we solve that, what are we doing in other countries? We got to figure this stuff out, and I think that's the perfect study ground, because you could say, oh, those people have a criminal mentality, but that's exactly what you're saying about these other countries, is everybody operates for their own best interest. Everybody's looking for the shortcut, for the thing that works for them, and that's what's going on in prison. So, I don't know, I'm trying to put the two worlds together, but it just seems like very fertile ground for study.
Well, let me say one thing about, you asked a complex question and it has many features, but one of them has to do with, are people studying this? And I think that one of the things we've identified is that the role of violence is not simply limited to those countries that exhibit violence. That the role of violence is fundamental to all developing countries in the sense that if they don't have a solution to this problem, then they are violent. And so I think violence is studied in way too limited a way, because it's thought about as failed, associated with failed states. That is, cases where there is actual violence. Whereas part of what we're saying is some of the really profound implications of violence occurs where they've been able to prevent it.
Yeah, I'd like to second that, and then come back to the crime example, which is that no society eliminates violence. Fox News tonight will have something. Right? And so it's not a matter of eliminating it and pretending it's been eliminated. It's how does society structure incentives so people are less violent and less likely to do it, and can believe in people will be peaceful and credible, and particularly how people that maybe they don't know, or how can we believe it personally that we're all the same and therefore we can deal with one another even though we don't know. And I think as societies get better organized, they become much more dangerous. And so when violence breaks out, it's World War II and 15 million people are going to die. It's not that open access societies are necessarily less violent. And as societies get more productive and more powerful, when violence happens, it has serious implications. So we're not saying there's an order of violent, less violent, less violent, less violent, less violent society. That's not an implication of what we're saying. We're saying that the societies are organized in different ways. Now, I think the crime family problem, or model, is a great model of the natural state. And one of the things that, when we talk about this is a much more complicated theory than we can explain in half an hour. And it always comes across as though the dominant coalition has all the benefits and everybody else is peons. And that's how I told the story. But in fact, the rents that the leaders get are closely related to the services that they can provide to the members of their patronage networks, or their crime families, or their kinship networks, or their church, or religion, or whatever. So that we observe persistently in societies this not impersonal way of organizing people. And then the question is, well, how do you kill people across those boundaries? And it may be that the guys on top say, that guy's got to die. So the rules about how those patronage or crime family organizations go are not formal rules, because there isn't a state with a monopoly on violence to enforce them. They have to be what we would call an adherent organization. The rules have to be enforced within that group, because there's nobody outside of it to enforce it. But that does not mean there's not rules, and does not mean there's not interaction, and this does not mean that the peons don't get protection. In fact, that's one of the major things that they're getting. Is they're living in a society in which violence is ordered in a different way. So the societies that we really worry about are the ones where it appears to be completely random, because there's so much disorder. But in fact, in those societies, what do? They organize as natural states right away. They want warlords. They want a person who can protect a particular geographic area, or ethnic area, or patronage network. And the crime families, I think, are a great example, thinking about that logic of the natural state in a world in which there can be no third parties. Fragile natural state.
Thanks. Joseph Sani from the School of Public Policy, George Mason University, PhD students. You mentioned, my question goes to Professor Knott. You mentioned at the beginning that there are three critical factors in your analysis: time, history, and culture. I was just wondering if geography plays any role. Because when I look at those natural states, it seems to me there is a geography. I'm sorry, my accent. Yeah, when we look at those natural states, it seems to me they are clustered around some geographical areas. And then when we look at the influence of bad neighborhoods in the spread of chaos, I'm thinking of the conflict system in the Mano River, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and other places. So does geography play any role in that, in your model?
I think it depends on on the time when you're talking. Geography, obviously, historically, has played an immense role, particularly because of the incidence of disease and crime and the complex things that result from that. So that we observed historically that tropical places were poorer than temperate climate. But I think now in the modern world that is much less likely, and there's different criteria that affect performance, of which, as I said, the most crucial ones are the ones that John and Barry have mentioned in their discussion, which prevent you from moving out of the natural state or limited access. And I think we've talked enough about that, so I won't repeat them.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Steve Webb from the World Bank. This is to some extent to suggest an answer to the question of a couple of examples of the predictive power of this framework. As John suggested, I've been thinking about this quite a while. Let me just mention two examples. One would be Zimbabwe. Okay, sure. Okay.
One last question.
After your next question.
Question is, do you agree? Okay. The hypothesis is that the core of the problem in Zimbabwe is not Mugabe. The problem is that there are very violent organizations there, and if he died of a heart attack tomorrow, you'd still have a big problem there. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were violent groups, and to think you could put in an open access order constitution and have an open access order democracy was ridiculous. And to the extent some of the success we've had in Iraq in the last year or so has been because these violent organizations, the Sunni Awakening, were recognized as that they would be allowed to continue as organizations with violence potential and help organize the violence rather than centralize it. What do you think of that?
That's very good.
We like it.
One more question.
I have
Question. Just short question.
I hope it's short. Thank you. My name is Yan Li. I'm a PhD candidate in the econ department. My question is, in the doorstep conditions, the descriptions mostly are around distribution of political power or distribution of rights. Could that be, there's no mention of distribution of wealth. And as we see these countries, states where they have relatively open access order, they seem to be relatively wealthy in per capita basis. And it's also possible states where wealth gap within the population is smaller, it's easier to provide a stable situation for eco-political access. So is there possible economic distribution conditions for the social order?
Well, I think wealth is very important, but I think it's separate from the doorstep conditions. It may be that wealth has something to do with what countries are more likely to be able to move from, say, what we call a mature natural state to the doorstep conditions. But I don't think it is a doorstep condition. I think, and so I think causally it may be related to the process of the transition, but I don't think it is part of the doorstep conditions.
With that, let me thank our three speakers. We welcome you to continue the discussion outside in the reception area.